Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another Center for Humanities Research Colloquium. I'm Sylvester Johnson. I want to give special thanks to Dominique Francesca and Shah Jahan, who are with the Center for Humanities, help organize this event. To Joe Ford, who is in the Athenaeum and directing activities for digital programming and very talented helping us with this recording and also making podcasts. Of course, we're here for the presentation by Professor Shaily Patel. She is associate professor in the Department of Religion and Culture, assistant professor, excuse me, in the Department of Religion and Culture, and her research examines early Christianity, Greco-Roman religions, magic in antiquity, and critical theory and ideological criticism. Professor Patel's work explores various and often contradictory ways that discourses of magic were used to advance myriad theological ends in early Christian literature. Today, she's going to present research dealing with magic and the making of Christianity. So please join me in a digital virtual applause for Professor Shaily, who will share with us her work. And just a reminder that we will be having a Q&A. And so we want to invite you to just place your questions in the chat. And then that actually is very useful for allowing us to moderate the Q&A. Our intention is that we'll call on you to answer your questions in order, but if you just put them in the chat, it helps us to handle the queue, and we'll know in what order to call on you. So without further ado, Professor Patel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on a Friday afternoon in these circumstances. Thanks to Sylvester for that introduction, and thanks to the Center for the Humanities for the invitation. I also want to thank Dominique and Joe in particular for making the transition to the digital format smooth. I want to let you all know that I decided to talk about the Gospel of Luke today rather than Origen's Contra Celsum. Methodologically, I'm going to be advancing the same argument as stated in the abstract for this talk. Frankly, I think Luke's gospel is just far more exciting than Origen's Contra Celsum, but I'm happy to take questions about Origen in the Q&A if anybody cares about patristic literature. Okay, so let's get started. When your area of expertise is magic and you give papers like these, the first thing you generally have to do is defend your definition of magic. But I'm not going to do that this afternoon, because what I really want to talk about is how ancient writers manipulated the category of magic, and how ultimately writers like the author of Luke's Gospel made magic disappear from early Christian texts. So magic in early Christianity is an act of smoke and mirrors, in my view. See what I did there? Early Christian writers narrate practices stereotypically performed by magicians, but then they deflect the larger question of what magic is in order to spare their own heroes the taint of being associated with the marketplace practitioner. So they keep the magical deeds, but they don't want to invite comparisons to magicians. I feel like our task then is to figure out how and why they do this. So that being said, I do want to offer the following, and I'm just going to share my screen with you all. I'm going to start. Okay, so I want to offer the following understanding of magic so you have some sense of how I'm conceiving of it as I talk. Briefly, I think of magic as this vast contradictory discourse. It has a rhetorical component, meaning that it can be used as a derogatory label against outsiders. In ancient literature, those who are called magicians are very rarely depicted positively. We do have exceptions to that, though. Magic also has another dimension, that of activities that are narrated in our texts. And I'm just calling this the practical or narrative component for the sake of convenience. What I mean by this is that certain activities are implicated in deciding who is or is not a magician. Some of those activities are things like exorcisms and healings. These are activities that Jesus was so famous for. Others include things like love spells or reanimation necromancy, which our Christian authors generally avoided. Now, most modern scholars of early Christianity tend to focus on this component here, the rhetorical component, the first aspect of the discourse of magic. They gloss over the second index, that of activities that draw the accusation. To me, this scholarly tendency serves an apologetic purpose. It serves to distinguish Christianity from other forms of ritual practice. Because if you divorce actions from rhetoric and you claim that anything and everything could be magic, then anything and everything could not be magic as well. And so this current scholarly consensus runs a little like this. Someone like Jesus might have been called a magician by Roman pagans who wished to discredit him. But Christians themselves imagined Jesus' deeds to be miraculous, not magical, since they were insiders to the tradition. And so while this distinction between miracle and magic is only rhetorical, ancient believers would have understood it to be fundamental and essential. I want you to hang on to this scholarly assertion that Christians on the ground likely imagined Jesus' deeds to be miraculous and not magical, because I am not so sure that this was the case. Based on the evidence that we have, it seems like these ancient Christians on the ground did not make the same sorts of negotiations between magic and miracle that our ancient writers made. In fact, from what we can tell, and there's been good recent research on this, ancient writers were bent on creating distinctions between magic and miracle precisely because everyday people didn't. So, in other words, Christian texts are a prescription, not a description. They show us the picture of Jesus and the disciples that they want us to see. And in this case, our author wants us to see the heroes of the Christian tradition as miracle workers and not magicians. This is a pretty simple assertion, and I think most scholars would agree with me that ancient literary texts are illusions. But I think the same scholars might bristle when I tell them that some deeds were more likely to draw the charge of magic, and that ancient people had some idea of what sorts of services a magician might offer. And as such, Jesus' deeds are quite likely to be interpreted as magical by most people on the ground. Our Christian writers, therefore, had to find ways of redirecting an audience's interpretation of these deeds. Smoke and mirrors, right? So any meaningful talk of magic in early Christian literature has to go beyond our author's literary allusions. We have to start searching for these devices that they use, these tells, the things our authors hide in order to create their ideal protagonists. By reading against the grain, we can see the traces of this creative process, and consequently, we can learn a great deal about the function of ancient texts and how deeply practices associated with magic were woven into the very fabric of early Christianity. So this brings me to the texts themselves, and especially the canonical Gospel of Luke. Before I turn to Luke, though, I want to draw your attention to the following passage from a text called the Metamorphoses. The Metamorphoses is an ancient fantasy novel, really. It's written in the late 2nd century by a man named APULEIUS. This tale revolves around the adventures of Lucius, who's a precocious man who has this keen desire to see and learn magic. In particular, Lucius wants to witness the, quote, magical deeds of the witch Pamphile, and he wants to become her apprentice, even though he's warned against this, right? And even though he knows that the cost of pursuing the path of magic is pretty high. So Lucius knows that this is going to ruin him, and then he nevertheless seeks the, quote, always desirable name of magic. Our author, APULEIUS, has this ambivalence towards magic here that should give us some pause, even though the Metamorphoses is a work of fiction. Lucius's story presents two opposing cultural trends. One is the seductive allure of magic as a means of gaining power. And the other is the categorical vilification of people who practice magic. To me, I think this ambiguity is intellectually fruitful because APULEIUS' text suggests that one might participate in magic while being simultaneously aware of its bad reputation. To put it bluntly, not everybody who worked magic thought of themselves as a hallowed miracle worker. And in fact, we have a preponderance of evidence to corroborate these contradictory tendencies. In her book, At the Temple Gates, Heidi Wendt tells us that freelance religious specialists like magicians were popular among the masses, but widely reviled in elite literary circles. Many marketplace specialists offered a range of services to ancient Romans, from curing a migraine to ensuring success in a court case, to winning over a lover, to engaging in philosophical disquisition on the nature of God and the universe even. The popularity of these practitioners alarmed elite members of literary circles, and like so many threatened elites, ancient writers protected their positions by targeting these specialists with a lot of ridicule and vitriol. So texts like the Metamorphoses expose this contradiction in the culture of ancient magic. Everyday people sought out magicians and those like them, while ancient writers maligned magic as the purview of questionable individuals with questionable motives. But what do these sorts of inconsistencies have to do with the Gospel of Luke and early Christian texts more broadly? Well, I think it's kind of foolish to assume that Christian texts don't betray the same cultural tendencies as classical counterparts. Texts are not created in vacuums, not even Christian texts. And when we understand Luke's gospel as a prescription against the marketplace magician, we find that Luke too reflects contradictions similar to those in APULEIUS' Metamorphoses and in other texts. He, like Lucius, wants to harness magic's power, but he also knows that there's a danger in pursuing it. In order to resolve this problem, he employs two distinct strategies in the text to make magic disappear, as I've been saying. Rhetorically, he strips Jesus' wonder working of the more problematic characteristics of magical practices, softening them and making them less likely to draw suspicion. And in terms of the narrative, he leverages Jesus' deeds to legitimate him as God's prophet and Messiah. So by foregrounding certain aspects of Jesus' identity and sanitizing his deeds of the more suspicious traits of magic, Luke vanishes the question of what is or is not magic. But I would argue that we should not be taken in by this sleight of hand, right? So I want to move to some of the nitty-gritty details of Luke's text. And I'm going to get granular, but I want to give you a sense of how this works. So let me start with my first assertion that Luke softens the way he describes those deeds of Jesus that are most likely to be read as magic. And here we have some help in figuring out Luke's emphases, because we know that he used the Gospel of Mark as one of his sources. So we can figure out what Luke cares about by reading how he changes the tradition he received from Mark. So when Luke narrates magical practices, he makes very telling and very precise changes to Mark's version of events. He makes these activities less conforming to the stereotypical trappings of magic as conceived in like the broader Greco-Roman imagination. In a sense, he makes the deeds less magical. So for example, let's take a look at Mark 5 and Luke 8. Now, this is the famous story of Jesus revivifying the synagogue leader's daughter. This is a lot to read out loud, so I'll give you a minute to scan this slide. So, in this passage, Luke follows Mark pretty closely, which we expect, but he makes two very small yet crucially important exceptions, both of which might be perceived as troubling aspects of magical practice: secrecy and foreign terminology in the context of ritual healing. Secrecy is associated with magical practices in wider Greco Roman literature. To be sure, secrecy itself is not enough to make an act magical, but the private nature of Jesus's revivification in Mark 5:35 through 42 might give an observer some apprehensions. In fact, our old friend APULEIUS, the author of the Metamorphoses, was criminally charged and tried for doing evil deeds of magic. And one of the things that helped build the charge against Apuleius was his supposed performance of private nocturnal rites. So notice here that unlike in Mark, Luke's Jesus does not throw out all the mourners. So in Mark 40, he throws out all the mourners once he enters the house, and we don't have that. We have everyone was weeping and mourning. And so Mark 40 implies that Jesus, the little girl's parents, and the disciples are the only ones who witness this revivification. In contrast, Luke's Jesus cries out to the little girl in front of the mourners who are in the house. This is a really subtle intensification, but it suggests that that Jesus's words in Luke are meant for the entire household, the mourners included. Mark's Jesus, on the other hand, speaks to a more select group. Now, this is one example of a larger trend throughout the gospel. When Mark's Jesus heals or exorcises in private, Luke changes the text to make the act more public. To be fair, in the ancient world, private rites seem to carry negative associations on their own, even apart from a connection with magic. In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate passed a number of laws curtailing the worship of Bacchus. One of these laws prohibited worshippers from forming conspiracies. The seemingly secret nature of Christian worship also brought suspicion. When writing to the Emperor Trajan in 112, Pliny, who is the governor of Pontus Bithynia, described the imprisonment and torture of Christians who ignored his ban on secret meetings. So, given the general concerns over secrecy in the Roman world, it's conceivable here that maybe Luke just wants Jesus to be a more public figure, and that his changing Mark has nothing to do with magic. Now, I would concede that, but if you look at the full range of changes that Luke makes to Mark, we see changes in exactly those parts of the text where Jesus's marvels correspond too closely to aspects of magic that bothered contemporaries. So to put it another way, Luke retains Jesus's wonders, but he strips these activities of their most problematic characteristics, thereby diminishing the likelihood that his readers would draw comparisons between Jesus and other literary magicians. The same story in Luke 8 also highlights a second of Luke's concerns relating to magic: Mark's use of the Aramaic here, talitha kum. Foreign or unintelligible terminology was also thought to be characteristic of magic, though this was not always treated with suspicion. So Euripides' Iphigenia is depicted as singing foreign songs, quote, like a magician. In fact, if we imagine magicians performing spells like those described in spell books from the period, foreign and unintelligible words appear to be a means of communicating with supernatural entities, of addressing them by name or harnessing their power. In contrast, in the Gospel of Luke, the efficacious words Jesus speaks are in everyday Greek. Our author's point here, I don't think, is very subtle, right? Here he's saying that there's nothing extraordinary about the words Jesus speaks. Only Jesus himself is extraordinary. So unlike other magicians, Jesus need not rely on ritual language or incantations to access supernatural power or effect marvels. He simply speaks and it's done. Most telling for me, though, is that Jesus' simple exhortations are actually picked up by later Christian writers who wanted to create a very clear way to distinguish Jesus from magicians. So many of our church fathers argued that the simplicity of Christian exorcisms and healings set Christians apart from others, or even other heretical Christians. Tertullian of Carthage, for example, claims that Christians exorcise through prayer and very simple adjurations. Likewise, Origen says the same, right? Prayer and very simple adjurations. Just as an aside, simple adjurations also appear in Greco-Roman literature, so it's not an exclusively Christian thing based on the evidence. But writers like Origen will still seize upon the uncomplicated nature of Christian exorcisms as a means of differentiating Christian praxis from that of outsider magicians. Truly stunning here is that many modern scholars of early Christianity will parrot these same assertions. So they're parroting the church fathers by also claiming that Jesus was thought to be different from other magicians because his power resided in his person as opposed to any exorcistic technique or formula. Sometimes Luke does not change a story so much as omit it altogether. This is the case with something like Mark 7:32 through 36. In this passage, Jesus heals a deaf man who has a speech impediment. It reads, "They brought him a man, both deaf and having a speech impediment, and they begged him so that he might lay his hands. And taking him aside in private, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into his ears. He spat and touched the man's tongue. Then looking up towards heaven, Jesus sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened and his tongue was released and he spoke plainly." As with the redaction of the raising of the synagogue leader's daughter, this omission purges foreign phrases that may be misunderstood, at least when uttered in the context of activities that could be read as magical. If the Aramaic were the only problematic aspect of this story, Luke might have easily omitted a few words, but doing so would not resolve all his concerns. This account, and others, foreground a third tendency that softens associations with magic. In Luke, Jesus never heals through substances, like saliva or specially prepared ritual ingredients, though he's often depicted as healing through touch or the divine power that resides within his body. Since the story of the deaf man includes both foreign words and the use of such substances, it might have been too problematic for Luke to save. And we have another example too. Luke's omission of Mark 8:22 through 26, the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida. In Mark's version, Jesus' healing is effected using saliva, and Luke omits it. So Luke omits Mark's stories of healing through substances, but why? Because this too carries associations with magical practices as they're stereotyped. We see a preoccupation with magical material come to the fore in other ancient texts. One of them is something like APULEIUS' Apology, where Apuleius is accused of using fish parts to cook up love potions. Texts like these depict those working magic as being thought to use specially prepared substances or even bodily substances to facilitate their deeds. In Mark's gospel, Jesus' spit is imbued with some sort of healing power, but Luke jettisons this notion. The result is that just as Luke's Jesus did not need foreign incantations to invoke supernatural entities, neither does he require the use of magical material to effect exorcisms or healings. All that said, we do get a sense that there is a special power that animates Jesus' wonders. In Luke 9:46, Jesus notices that the, quote, power has gone out of him, when a woman with a hemorrhage touches the fringe of his cloak. Luke 5:17 tells us that the power was with Jesus to heal. This power is the Holy Spirit, though it's not always explicitly named. Luke's use of the Spirit is another way of creating difference between Jesus and other literary magicians. The Holy Spirit is the agent that animates all of Jesus' ministry, from his exorcisms and his healings, even to his preaching. Luke repeatedly pits the divine power of the Spirit against demonic powers, implying that Jesus is this legitimate, Spirit-endowed agent of the Jewish God. He's a designated messenger of God spreading the good news, and he's not some crass marketplace magician. In fact, Jesus' healings regularly culminate with crowds glorifying God. So this makes Jesus special, this Spirit, right? Because magicians do not lead people to God. But let me be clear, these notions that the source of Jesus' power resided within his own person, that he was a messenger of the Jewish God who worked his wonders through the Holy Spirit, these are differences that Luke constructs. There is really little evidence to suggest that divine agency was a means of separating magicians from miracle workers in contemporary Greco-Roman literature. To say nothing of society more broadly, magicians were thought to appeal to multiple supernatural entities without necessarily separating them by tradition. So by limiting and highlighting the single divine power through whom Jesus performs his deeds, Luke separates his protagonist from these other magicians. And neither is Luke's emphasis on preaching unique. According again to work like that of Heidi Wendt, those who were considered magicians could also provide philosophical knowledge on the nature of God and the world. So just to summarize what we've gone through so far, Luke changes Mark in the following ways. He omits secrecy, foreign utterances, the use of substances. All of these are stereotypical trappings of magic. He posits the Holy Spirit as the sort of divine agent animating Jesus's ministry, and highlights how Jesus's deeds lead believers to God. These strategies for differentiating Jesus function to restrict readers' interpretations of Jesus's actions. In essence, they strip Jesus's wonder workings of those characteristics that are more amenable to negative interpretation and more susceptible to drawing an accusation of magic. Interestingly enough, subsequent Christian writers defend Jesus against charges of magic by appealing to these exact characteristics: the public nature and simplicity of Jesus's actions, how he did his work through the Spirit, how he led people to God. And so what's really fascinating when you look at the trend of Christian literature is that Luke's strategies for distinguishing Jesus from other magicians work. At least they work for the Christian writers who came after him, because they are picking up on what Luke is saying, and they're using it to defend Jesus against charges of magic. Even so, Luke cannot simply strip Jesus's deeds of their problematic aspects, because the deeds themselves still exist. And we must remember that these very activities are often implicated in negotiating what is or is not magic in the wider Greco-Roman world. That is, when we read about what magicians do in ancient texts, they do things similar to Jesus. By sanitizing these activities, as I talked about, Luke might give the impression that his Jesus is not like those other guys. But if he doesn't want his audience to misinterpret who Jesus is, he has to give them more. He has to explain what Jesus's deeds are if they are not magic. So this brings me to that second larger strategy of making magic disappear from the gospel, that of leveraging narratives of magical deeds for a unique theological vision that basically verifies Jesus's identity. So Luke's gospel narrates a number of magical deeds like exorcisms, healings, multiplication of objects, revivification of the dead. He also performs natural wonders like stilling a storm. These stories complete the underlying presupposition that we find in what I'm calling the rhetorical level of magical discourse, that Jesus isn't a magician, he is something else. So, what is Jesus in Luke? Well, the answer is disarmingly simple. Jesus is what he says he is, a Jewish prophet as well as the prophesied Messiah. His wonders serve as proofs for who he is, for establishing these identities. It's so obvious that Jesus himself makes the connection between who he is and what he does. He explicitly describes the activities attendant to prophethood and messiahship in 3 places. So these are the things that you need to do if you're God's prophet or Messiah. So you find these in Isaiah 4, in Luke 4, in Luke 7, and Luke 9. It's worth considering these passages in some detail. So let me start with the first. Luke 4, 18 through 19 marks the inauguration of Jesus' ministry. He's just been in the desert being tempted. He's come back. He goes to his hometown synagogue at Nazareth. And there he's invited to read from the scroll of Isaiah. This reading includes a summary of deeds done by God's Messiah, which include bringing good news to the poor, proclaiming release to those in bondage, recovering sight of the blind, freeing the oppressed, and proclaiming the acceptable year of the Lord. After reading, Jesus states that Isaiah's prophecy has been fulfilled, presumably in him. This very same Isaiah passage makes another appearance in Luke 7, where followers of John the Baptist come to ask Jesus whether or not he's the Messiah. He answers them, "Go and tell John what you've seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the injured walk, those with leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, and the poor are brought the good news." In other words, Jesus' marvels should provide all the answer John's disciples need to figure out who he is. Similarly, in 932, the Pharisees warn Jesus that he's about to be put to death. He replies that he casts out demons and offers cures and that he'll finish his work by the 3rd day. And then he adds, "Yet today, tomorrow, and the next day, I must be going because it's impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem." This Luke 9 passage connects God's work, or God's prophet, to the work of exorcism and healing. So the offices of prophet and Messiah both require performing marvels, and in particular, those marvels that look pretty magical. So by leveraging Jesus' deeds towards proving his worthiness to hold these titles, Luke makes a firm claim about who he is. And he is most definitely not a magician. And yet, I would argue, the danger of misinterpretation isn't completely averted. Because if other figures can also heal blindness or cure leprosy or restore mobility, are they not also prophets and messiahs? To solve this issue, Luke turns to Jesus' fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. Jesus is the one about whom the prophets wrote, not some random magician offering cures in the marketplace. But I think more important is our author's complementary strategy here to substantiate Jesus' identity, and that is the appeal to faith. Luke links access to Jesus' wonders to faith, specifically to faith in Jesus' identity as prophet and Messiah. Faith results in salvation. So people will be saved from illnesses, from ill winds, from hunger, from physical infirmity. But only those who view Jesus correctly can receive this salvation. To think of Jesus as anything other than prophet or Messiah is tantamount to denying oneself not only his miracles, but also God's salvation. So according to Luke, there's this danger in mistaking Jesus' identity. I want to pause here because I want you all to appreciate the author's sheer audacity. I mean, essentially what he's saying is that Jesus' wonders are prophetic and messianic because Jesus says they are. And if you believe differently, well, then you can forget about being saved. Like, that is a stunning example of circular reasoning. And what's wild is that so many of our Christian writers have to engage in these similar intellectual acrobatics because they want to keep magical practices without audiences assuming that their protagonists are magicians. So to negotiate between those two poles, they have to do a lot of this work, right? Anyway, we can see this focus on faith in a very famous story like the stilling of the storm. The story begins with Jesus sleeping, and he and the disciples are sailing out across a stormy lake. The storm intensifies, and the disciples cry out, "We're lost." In response, Jesus wakes and rebukes the storm, using the same language he uses to rebuke demons in other parts of the text. So this is an exorcism of sorts. But the heart of the passage lies in Jesus' scolding of the disciples after he performs this marvel. "Where is your faith?" he demands. And the disciples in turn wonder about Jesus' identity if even the winds obey him. Now, given that Jesus explicitly claims to be the Messiah in Luke 7, you would think that the disciples would know who he is. But these guys just can't get it right. In contrast, though, the audience should have no questions about Jesus' identity. Jesus is somebody who wields godlike power over the cosmos and who can save his followers. There are Old Testament resonances underlying this story that suggest this salvation that we're talking about is not just a physical thing. It's not just being saved from the storm. It's also an existential thing. In Jeremiah 25, the Lord roars against all nations like a storm and exacts judgment upon them. And there are other references as well. But the point is that in light of these Old Testament references, the disciples' fear of being lost is magnified. They're in all sorts of danger. So Jesus' calming of the storm works like a declaration of his identity. It demonstrates that he can save, not just from physical harm, but also from divine judgment. And so his admonishment, "Where is your faith?" demands recognition that he is the Messiah. By highlighting the disciples' misunderstanding here, I think Luke challenges his audience not to make the same mistake. Their faith must not waver. And this is reiterated over and over and over again in the gospel when Jesus performs wonders for those who display faith. For people like the centurion who implores Jesus to heal his slave, or the 10 men afflicted with leprosy who beseech him for mercy. Your faith has made you well, he says time and time again. But how does prioritizing faith relate to my larger discussion of magic in Luke's gospel? It seems to me that these stories are a pedagogical expedient designed to teach the audience how to approach Jesus, if not as a magician. If we assume an audience that might be enticed by magic's allure and inclined to see Jesus' deeds as magical, we can see why Luke would be so insistent on this point of faith. Believers must have faith in Jesus and in the salvation he professes. He must be understood as God's prophet and Messiah. And Jesus' faith-driven wonders conform to his own summaries of prophetic and messianic expectations. Corollary to this is the assertion that one cannot understand Jesus as a magician and still expect to reap the benefits of his ministry, whether those benefits are physical or spiritual. So Luke effectively redirects the question of whether or not Jesus is a magician by highlighting his role in this larger salvation history. If you're thinking about being saved from existential threat, you're not really concerned about who is or is not a magician, right? So this trend of linking Jesus' wonder working to a larger message continues throughout the text, and it's especially manifest in exorcism stories, like the Beelzebub controversy of Luke 11. As I suggested earlier, Luke's discourse of magic is a kind of literary illusion. Jesus the magician disappears, whereas Jesus the Messiah and prophet are reflected for the audience's benefit. But perhaps Luke's greatest trick is convincing us that magicians, messiahs, and prophets are mutually exclusive classes of practitioners. It makes more sense, though, that this is a difference that Luke and other Christian writers are again constructing. In fact, Jesus was called a magician by later pagan writers, lending evidence to a broader taxonomic muddling among ritual specialists. Apparently for Luke, though, it was possible to classify and separate magicians from messiahs. And more than possible, it was necessary, since interpreting Jesus correctly is a requirement for salvation. I think we should be careful, though. Luke may wish to distinguish between messiahs and magicians, but ancient evidence reveals that these categories of practice were not as stable as we might like. There's been some recent work on this. I mentioned Heidi Wendt. Gideon Bohak also wrote a book called Ancient Jewish Magic. In his book, he proves that activities that were widely imagined as magical proliferated in ancient Jewish texts and were performed by prophets and messiahs. Elijah manipulates object and weather. Elisha heals and cures disease. So Jewish literature is rife with deeds corresponding to magic in the ancient imagination. In other words, there's no contradiction between ancient Judaism and ancient magic, except in the minds of modern scholars who've assumed an incompatibility because of biblical injunctions against magic in texts like Deuteronomy and Leviticus. In truth, we don't have evidence that these prohibitions reflected lived realities. From what evidence we do have, it seems more likely that texts like Deuteronomy and Leviticus represent an ideal where all rules are followed and no one solicits the services of a magician. So despite the ancient evidence, which is ambiguous and complicated, we scholars impart a kind of intellectual fixity to early Christian literary constructions. Our author claims that miracle is distinct from magic. So for him, and for most early Christians, it must have been. If Jesus' deeds occur within a rich context of Jewish salvation history, then he can't practice magic because messiahs cannot be magicians. But it seems to me that Luke rather successfully seduces us into imagining this state of affairs. When we read closely, however, his text betrays anxieties about magic and about its application to Jesus' activities. That is, he seems to know what bothered people about magic, and he created ways to insulate Jesus from these problematic aspects of magical practices. But we become his accomplices if we take him at his word. And so to correct course in our investigation of magic in early Christian texts, we need a slight methodological reorientation. This means refusing to accept our author's propositions without first looking for the facets of magical discourse that they try to hide or redirect. It means grappling with this vast dynamic discourse of magic in a corpus of evidence inclusive of literary texts, material artifacts, and spell books. And also looking at evidence from Christian and non-Christian contexts. This kind of work also means abandoning modern instincts to draw a hard line between messiahs and magicians, and further resisting the oftentimes implicit understanding of magic as an obverse of established traditions like Judaism. Instead of reproducing our author's easy binaries, we should interrogate how they create differences among practitioners and their respective traditions. In the grand scheme of things, I think what the discourse of magic in a text like the Gospel of Luke teaches us is that the most interesting questions don't have yes or no answers. Asking whether or not Jesus was a magician is really not that fascinating, in my opinion. I think the more meaningful question really is about how magic disappears, about how by softening its contours or leveraging magical activities towards ends that we moderns might term, quote, religious, our author transmutes magic into miracle. And in this, perhaps, I think Luke is as much a magician as APULEIUS or Pamphile. So thank you all for your attention this afternoon.